Last year, in its Energy Future Report, the Canadian Energy Regulator, in its analysis, said that Line 3 pipeline, Keystone XL pipeline, and the Trans Mountain Expansion pipeline, all three were needed to provide pipeline capacity for Canadian oil and gas out to 2040. This year's report, just released, says something different. And maybe one of those pipelines isn't needed. As you can imagine, that's all sorts of political controversy. So we're going to talk to economist Kent Fellows from the University of Calgary in the School of Public Policy about this new forecast. So welcome to the interview, Kent.
My pleasure.
What did the CER report say?
So the CER report, at least insofar as pipelines are concerned, they outlay these two different sort of scenarios or projections for the future. They've got this, what would be comparable to their baseline case that they've published in the past, and I'm blanking on the exact phrase here, but they've also got this case where we're doing a projection based on more stringent climate policy, and in particular having a little bit more attention paid to greenhouse gas emissions from petroleum products south of the border. So, I mean, they say export markets, but really for us here in Alberta, that's thinking about the US market in particular. And so they've got these two different scenarios. The baseline one, not a whole lot different than 2019. I mean, it is different, but not a huge departure. But this newer sort of more stringent policy that does reflect a pretty significant change from the numbers that we've seen from the CER in the past.
Kent, we run into this all the time, and particularly with International Energy Agency scenario modeling, they get treated like predictions or forecasts when they're not. They are under a certain set of policies and market conditions. We think that here's one scenario. If that changes, here's another scenario. And that's really what we've got here, because Joe Biden becoming president could change everything, or maybe it doesn't change everything. We don't really know. And so I guess there's a danger in treating this as a forecast.
Yeah, I mean, it's always tricky when you get into this mix of sort of normative versus positive analysis, right? And the Canadian Energy Regulator, and as you mentioned, the EIA and the IEA, looking backwards, it's very clear that, you're doing analysis. If you're looking at the last 6 months, year, 10 years of data, you can do analysis there. You don't have to make a lot of assumptions. You can be really clear about your assumptions. Looking forward, by its very nature, requires assumptions. And so they use this language very carefully about whether something is a projection or saying that something is a projection rather than being a forecast, because they want to be really clear that, they're not endorsing a potential path. They don't want firms and investors making investment decisions thinking that the CER is giving an opinion. They're really careful about trying not to put their opinion into the modeling. And that's why you see this language of projections. But I think here with this new projection in 2020 versus some of the stuff they've had in the past, they're kind of wading a little bit into that. And I don't want to say that I think that the CER is giving an opinion here because they are pretty clear and it's pretty spelled out what the assumptions are. But they're taking these non-baseline assumptions, these potential future changes, a little bit more seriously in the modeling exercise to produce the projection they're producing.
Last question, Kent, and this is something that is not well understood, and that's the difference between the demand for heavy crude oil and light sweet crude oil, because Alberta mostly ships out bitumen in the form of, and that's considered a heavy to ultra heavy crude. And there's about 5 million barrels a day of refining capacity in the US that uses heavy crude. And those respond to the refineries that do light and the refineries that do heavy respond differently to market conditions and supply conditions. And so even if there are stricter climate, emission, it doesn't necessarily mean that the Canadian exports and the heavy will be affected the same way the light will.
Yeah, no, I mean, you're absolutely right there. I'm not going to go so far as to say they're different markets because it is still the same market, but they are imperfect substitutes, using sort of the economic pedagogy, the jargon there. And the prices do not move one for one, right? As you mentioned, you've got different refineries that are teched up to take different types of crude. You get a different product slate from those different types as well. And so if you're sitting here in Alberta producing heavy oil, you're watching what's happening with some of the light, tight stuff in the US, shale production, conventional production, because that is going to impact your price and your demand. But increasingly, something like a Mexican Maya or some of those other fields that you mentioned, production coming out of those fields, or to put a fine point on it, not coming out of those fields, can have a pretty big impact on your price point and your demand. And we see this in the pricing dynamics. Some of it's been muted in the last 3 to 5 years because of a lack of pipeline takeaway capacity. So you end up with sort of this weird regional micro market where you're constrained trying to get out of the province. But as you get more pipeline capacity, we expect those things to harmonize, and thinking a little bit more seriously about being a price taker and what's the international price for heavy crude versus just crude. It's one of my pet peeves sitting here in Canada that you often get some of the less well-informed news outlets that are reporting a West Texas Intermediate benchmark price. I mean, really, if you're sitting here in Alberta, what you want is you want WCS, and then you want some international benchmark that's closer to the type of a product that increasingly we're producing. So like a Mexican Maya or something like that.
And another quick point that we should note is that much of Canadian exports is exported by integrated Canadian producers that have their own refineries and upgraders. And that has a big influence on the market as well, because you're not selling into the spot market.
Yeah, and I'll throw in also another observation here on the curtailment policy, and there was a lot of concern on that, on how it was going to affect producers of different sizes, right? And the provincial government really has designed and redesigned curtailment to make sure that it is protecting the smaller guys, trying to get them through what we were hoping was this short-term post 2014 or even more acute post 2018 price fall, because the larger guys, as you said, they're integrated. A lot of them own firm service on the pipelines, so they can weather these storms a little bit better than the smaller guys can, who see these prices fluctuate on the spot market and are dramatically affected by that.
Kent, thank you very much for this. Really appreciate it.
Always a pleasure.